The gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Leadville, Colorado, marking the end of one life and the beginning of a journey that would intertwine the fates of three souls seeking redemption in the unforgiving wilderness of 1879. Lucinda Tanner gripped the letter in her trembling hands, the words blurring as tears threatened to spill from her weary eyes. The news of her sister's death had arrived with the morning stage, along with an urgent plea that would set her on a perilous path across the Colorado Territory. The small cemetery on the outskirts of Willow Creek had grown by 2 graves in less than a month. Lucinda stood beside another widow, Lillian Thompson, both women shrouded in black, their faces partially concealed by mourning veils as they watched the earth swallow the remains of those they had loved. The spring air carried the scent of fresh pine and newly turned soil, a cruel reminder that while the world continued to bloom, their lives had withered under the harsh hand of fate. Mrs. Tanner, Reverend Phillips said softly after the final prayers had been spoken and the other mourners had departed. "I'm deeply sorry for your loss. Your husband was a good man." Lucinda nodded, unable to speak. Thomas had been a good man, but good men died just as easily as wicked ones in this land. A mining accident had claimed him, leaving her alone to manage their small homestead and the crushing weight of grief. "Mrs. Thompson." The Reverend turned to the other widow. "If there's anything the church can do—" "Thank you, Reverend," Lillian interrupted, her voice surprisingly steady for a woman who had just buried her husband. "But I believe Mrs. Tanner and I have matters to discuss." Lucinda glanced at the woman beside her. She knew little of Lillian Thompson, beyond the fact that her husband had been a banker who succumbed to a fever that had swept through town 2 weeks prior. They had exchanged pleasantries at church socials, but their lives had never intersected in any meaningful way until now. As the Reverend retreated, Lillian turned to Lucinda. "I received word from my sister in Leadville. She's gravely ill and I must go to her." "Leadville? That's nearly 200 miles through mountain passes and bandit country," Lucinda replied, her concern momentarily overshadowing her grief. "I'm aware of the dangers," Lillian said, a hint of determination flashing in her green eyes. "But I must go. I've already lost my husband. I cannot lose my sister as well." Lucinda hesitated before reaching into her pocket to retrieve the letter she had received that morning. "My sister in Leadville has died," she said softly. "Her husband passed last year, leaving her with 2 young children. Now I must collect them and bring them home." Lillian's expression softened. "Then it seems we are bound for the same destination. 2 women traveling alone." "It would be madness." "Perhaps," Lillian conceded, "but what choice do we have? I have inquired about hiring protection, but the cost is prohibitive." Lucinda considered their options. Traveling alone would be dangerous, but traveling together might improve their chances. Still, 2 women alone on the trail invited trouble of a kind that made her blood run cold. "I may know someone," Lucinda said slowly, thinking of the man her husband had once called friend. "A man who knows the territory and can handle himself in trouble. A guide." Lillian asked, hope flickering in her voice. "A cowboy," Lucinda corrected. "Ethan Yates. He was Thomas's friend before the accident. He rides with cattle drives, but he's between jobs now. If anyone could get us to Leadville safely, it would be him." "Can he be trusted?" Lillian's question hung in the air between them. Lucinda thought of the tall, quiet man who had carried Thomas's broken body from the mine, who had stayed with her through that terrible night, and who had disappeared with the dawn, unable to face the sorrow he could not mend. "With our lives," she answered softly, "but not with our hearts." The warning was as much for herself as for Lillian. 2 days later, Lucinda stood outside the run-down saloon at the edge of Willow Creek, gathering her courage. She had sold what she could of her possessions, packing only necessities for the journey ahead. The gold Thomas had painstakingly saved was sewn into the hem of her dress enough, she hoped, to start a new life with her sister's children. The saloon door swung open, and a man stumbled out, reeking of whiskey and tobacco. Lucinda stepped back, clutching her shawl tighter around her shoulders. This was no place for a respectable widow, but necessity drove her forward. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the sour smell of spilled beer. A piano played discordantly in the corner, competing with raucous laughter and the clink of glasses. Lucinda scanned the room, her gaze settling on a solitary figure at a back table. Ethan Yates sat alone, a glass of whiskey untouched before him, his weathered hat pulled low over his eyes. He looked older than when she had last seen him, though it had been only weeks. Grief aged a person. Lucinda knew that better than most. She approached his table, aware of the curious glances from the other patrons. "Mr. Yates," she said softly. He looked up, recognition and surprise crossing his features. "Mrs. Tanner," he said, rising to his feet, "you shouldn't be in a place like this." "I need to speak with you," Lucinda said, ignoring his comment. "It's urgent." Ethan glanced around the saloon, then gestured toward the door. Outside, they stepped into the late afternoon sun, the street quieter now as townspeople retreated to their homes for supper. "What's this about?" Ethan asked, his blue eyes studying her with concern. Lucinda explained about her sister, about the children who needed her, and about Lillian Thompson's ailing sister in Leadville. "We need to get there safely," she concluded. "We need your help." Ethan removed his hat, running a hand through his dark hair streaked with premature gray. "It's a dangerous journey, especially for women. Bandits, hostile Indians, not to mention the terrain itself. Winter's barely loosened its grip on those mountain passes." "We understand the risks," Lucinda insisted. "But we must go. Those children have no one else, and Mrs. Thompson's sister may not survive without her care." Ethan shook his head. "I'm sorry for your situation, Mrs. Tanner, truly I am, but I'm not a guide. I'm just a cowhand between jobs." "You're more than that," Lucinda said softly. "Thomas always said you were the best man with a gun and the surest hand with a horse he'd ever known. He trusted you. I trust you." The mention of Thomas cast a shadow over Ethan's face. "I couldn't save him," he said, his voice barely audible. "No one could," Lucinda replied, her throat tightening. "But you can help me now. I'll pay you fair wages." Ethan was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains that separated them from Leadville. "When do you aim to leave?" "The day after tomorrow," Lucinda said, hope rising in her chest. 2 days isn't much time to prepare for such a journey. "We've already begun our preparations. Mrs. Thompson has secured a wagon and I've gathered supplies." Ethan sighed, placing his hat back on his head. "I'll meet you at dawn, outside the general store. We'll need more supplies than you've likely accounted for, and weapons." "We have a rifle," Lucinda offered. "You'll need more than that where we're going," Ethan replied grimly. "I'll see to the rest." Relief flooded through Lucinda. "Thank you, Mr. Yates," he nodded curtly. "Don't thank me yet, Mrs. Tanner. Getting to Leadville alive is far from assured, even with my help." As she turned to leave, Ethan called after her, "Mrs. Tanner." She paused, looking back. "Thomas was my friend. I couldn't save him, but I'll do my damnedest to keep you safe. That's a promise." The sincerity in his voice touched something in Lucinda's heart that she thought had died with Thomas. She merely nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and hurried away. Dawn broke clear and cold on the day of their departure. The wagon stood ready outside the general store, loaded with supplies and covered with a heavy canvas. Lillian Thompson was already there, dressed in practical traveling clothes rather than mourning black, her blonde hair tucked neatly beneath a wide-brimmed hat. "Mrs. Tanner," she greeted Lucinda with a tense smile. "I was beginning to wonder if you had changed your mind." "Not at all," Lucinda assured her, glancing around. "Is Mr. Yates here yet?" "I am," came a deep voice from behind them. Ethan emerged from the store, carrying a rifle and a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. He had abandoned his usual cowboy attire for the garb of a frontiersman: buckskin jacket, sturdy denim pants, and high boots. A revolver hung at his hip, and a knife was sheathed at his belt. "Mrs. Thompson," he said with a nod to Lillian. "I trust Mrs. Tanner has explained the arrangement." "She has," Lillian replied, her gaze assessing him frankly. "And I appreciate your assistance, Mr. Yates. We couldn't make this journey without your protection." "Let's hope that protection isn't needed," Ethan said as he stowed the bundle in the wagon, "but it's best to be prepared." He helped both women onto the bench seat, then checked the harness one final time before climbing up beside them. The wagon was crowded with 3 adults, and Lucinda was acutely aware of Ethan's proximity as he took up the reins. "Last chance to reconsider," he said quietly. Lucinda exchanged a glance with Lillian, seeing the same determination in the other woman's eyes that she felt in her own heart. "We're ready, Mr. Yates." With a nod, Ethan flicked the reins and the horses lurched forward. Willow Creek fell away behind them as they headed west toward the towering peaks of the Rocky Mountains. Lucinda did not look back at the town where she had known both happiness and heartbreak. Her future lay ahead, uncertain but necessary. The first day passed without incident, the wagon trundling along a well-traveled road that followed the river valley. Ethan remained vigilant, his gaze constantly scanning the surroundings, one hand never far from his weapon. He spoke little, answering questions with brief responses, but otherwise keeping his thoughts to himself. As twilight approached, he guided the wagon off the road to a small clearing near the river. "We'll camp here," he announced, setting the brake and jumping down. "There's water for the horses, and the trees provide some shelter." He helped first Lillian, then Lucinda down from the wagon, his hand lingering a moment longer than necessary on Lucinda's waist. She felt a flutter of something unfamiliar, something she had no right to feel so soon after Thomas's death, and quickly stepped away. "I'll tend to the horses," Ethan said, not meeting her eyes. "If you ladies could gather firewood, we'll need it for cooking and warmth. The nights get cold in these parts, even in spring." As Lucinda and Lillian collected fallen branches near the campsite, they spoke in low voices, getting to know one another better. Lillian had been married for 5 years to a man 20 years her senior. Though not a love match, she had respected her husband and mourned his passing sincerely. Her sister in Leadville was her only remaining family, and the thought of losing her was unbearable. "And you, Mrs. Tanner," Lillian asked gently, "how long were you married?" 7 years, Lucinda replied, her throat tightening at the memory of Thomas's smile. "We were childhood sweethearts. He followed me west when my parents decided to leave Pennsylvania." "You were fortunate to have known such love," Lillian observed, her voice wistful. "Yes," Lucinda agreed, though the words seemed inadequate to describe what she had shared with Thomas. "Now I must focus on my sister's children. They'll need stability, care." "Children adapt surprisingly well," Lillian said, bending to pick up a thick branch. "It's adults who struggle with change." Lucinda considered this as they returned to camp, where Ethan had already started a small fire and was preparing a simple meal of beans and salt pork. He had spread bedrolls on either side of the fire, 2 on one side, 1 on the other. "You ladies can take that side," he said, nodding toward the paired bedrolls. "I'll keep watch for most of the night. You need rest too, Mr. Yates, Lucinda pointed out as she accepted a tin plate of food from him. I'm accustomed to long nights on cattle drives, he assured her. Besides, these parts aren't as safe as they once were. Apaches sometimes venture this far north, and there are always bandits looking for easy targets. Lillian's eyes widened at this, but she said nothing, focusing instead on her meal. After they had eaten, Ethan cleaned the plates in the river while Lucinda and Lillian prepared for sleep. As Lucinda settled onto her bedroll, she watched Ethan return to the fire and sit with his rifle across his knees, his profile illuminated by the dancing flames. There was a stillness about him that spoke of a man comfortable with solitude, yet she sensed a deep loneliness beneath his quiet exterior. "He's an interesting man, your Mr. Yates," Lillian murmured beside her. "He's not my Mr. Yates," Lucinda corrected, perhaps too quickly. Lillian's soft laugh drifted through the darkness. "Of course not, but he watches you when he thinks no one is looking." Lucinda turned onto her side, facing away from the fire and from Ethan's silent vigil. He was Thomas's friend, nothing more. But as sleep finally claimed her, Lucinda could not dispel the image of Ethan's blue eyes, clouded with a sorrow that mirrored her own. The journey grew more arduous as they left the river valley and began to climb into the foothills. The wagon groaned under its load, and the horses strained against the harness. Ethan worked tirelessly, guiding the team with a firm but gentle hand, stopping frequently to rest the animals and check for signs of trouble. On the third day, as they navigated a narrow pass between towering cliffs, Ethan suddenly reined in the horses, his body tensing. "What is it?" Lucinda asked, her hand instinctively reaching for the rifle stowed beneath the seat. Ethan put a finger to his lips, his gaze fixed on the ridge above them. "We're being watched," he said softly. Lillian gasped, her fingers digging into Lucinda's arm. "Indians? No," Ethan replied, slowly reaching for his rifle. "White men. Bandits, most likely." As if summoned by his words, 3 riders appeared on the trail ahead, blocking their path. Rough-looking men with unkempt beards and worn clothing, they each carried revolvers that gleamed dully in the afternoon sun. "Stay calm," Ethan murmured to the women. "Let me do the talking." The leader of the group, a heavy-set man with a scar bisecting his left cheek, urged his horse forward. "Afternoon, folks," he called, his friendly tone belied by the cold calculation in his eyes. "Looks like you're carrying quite a load there." "Just supplies," Ethan replied evenly. "We're headed to Leadville." "Leadville, eh?" The man grinned, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Dangerous journey for a man traveling with 2 such lovely ladies." His gaze lingered on Lillian, whose fair beauty remained striking even in plain traveling clothes. "We're managing just fine," Ethan said, his hand resting casually on his rifle. "Perhaps you could use some additional protection," the bandit suggested, his hand moving to his pistol. "For a reasonable fee, of course." "We're not carrying anything of value," Lucinda interjected, earning a warning glance from Ethan. The bandit laughed. "I'll be the judge of that, madam." He nodded to his companions, who began to flank the wagon. In one fluid motion, Ethan raised his rifle and aimed it at the leader's chest. "I wouldn't," he said, his voice dangerously soft. The bandits froze, assessing the situation. 3 against 1 were favorable odds, but Ethan's steady hand and unwavering gaze suggested he was no ordinary traveler. "Now, friend," the leader said, his smile fading. "No need for things to get unfriendly." "I'm not your friend," Ethan replied coldly. "And things got unfriendly the moment you decided to rob us." The tension stretched between them, broken only by the nervous stamping of the horses. Lucinda held her breath, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. Finally, The leader raised his hands in a gesture of surrender that didn't reach his eyes. "Seems we've had a misunderstanding. We were just concerned for fellow travelers, weren't we, boys?" His companions nodded, their hands still hovering near their weapons. "Then you'll understand if we continue on our way," Ethan said, not lowering his rifle. "Alone?" The bandit's eyes narrowed, but he nodded slowly. "Sure thing, friend. Safe travels to Leadville." He turned his horse aside, gesturing for his men to do the same. As the wagon passed, Lucinda felt the bandit's eyes on them, calculating and hungry. She knew with cold certainty that this wasn't over. "They'll be back," she whispered to Ethan once they were out of earshot. "I know," he replied grimly. "We need to find a defensible position before nightfall." They pushed on harder than before, the horses lathered with sweat as Ethan drove them up the winding mountain trail. The sun was sinking toward the western peaks when they finally reached a small plateau with a sheer rock face on one side and a clear view of the trail they had ascended. "We'll make camp here," Ethan announced, bringing the wagon close to the rock wall. "Help me move the supplies to form a barrier." Working quickly in the fading light, they arranged crates and barrels in a semicircle around the wagon, creating a makeshift fortress. Ethan forbade them from lighting a fire, instead distributing jerky and hardtack for a cold supper. "Try to get some rest," he told the women as darkness fell. "I'll wake you if there's trouble." "I can take a watch," Lucinda offered. "I know how to shoot." Ethan regarded her thoughtfully, then nodded. "Very well, I'll wake you in a few hours." Lillian, pale with fear but determinedly composed, settled into the wagon bed with a blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. "Will they really come back?" she asked in a small voice. "Best to assume they will," Ethan replied, checking his weapons one final time. "But we're ready for them now." Lucinda sat with her back against a barrel, her husband's rifle across her lap, listening to the night sounds of the mountain wilderness. Beside her, Ethan was a reassuring presence, solid and vigilant in the darkness. "You handled yourself well today," he said quietly, breaking the long silence. "I wasn't about to let them take what little we have," Lucinda replied. "It wasn't your words," Ethan clarified. "It was your calmness. Most women would have panicked." "I've found that panic rarely improves a situation," Lucinda said, thinking of the day the mine foreman had appeared at her door, hat in hand, unable to meet her eyes. She had not panicked then either, though her world had collapsed around her. Ethan nodded, a small smile touching his lips. "Thomas always said you were the steady one." The mention of her husband in this context, casual, almost intimate, caught Lucinda off guard. "He spoke of me to you, often," Ethan confirmed. "He was proud of your strength, your determination." A lump formed in Lucinda's throat. "I wish that strength had been enough to save him." "Some things can't be prevented," Ethan said softly, "no matter how strong we are." They fell silent again, each lost in private thoughts as the moon rose higher, casting silver light across the plateau. Eventually, Lucinda's eyes grew heavy, and she felt herself drifting despite her best efforts to stay alert. "Sleep," Ethan murmured, his voice low and gentle. "I'll keep watch a while longer." Lucinda didn't resist as he took the rifle from her hands and helped her settle more comfortably against the barrel. As consciousness faded, she felt the light touch of his hand brushing a strand of hair from her face, a gesture so tender it might have been a dream. The bandits came just before dawn, when the sky was lightening from black to deep blue. Ethan's hand over her mouth woke Lucinda instantly, his finger to his lips warning her to silence. He pointed toward the trail, where shadows moved with deliberate stealth. Lucinda nodded her understanding, and Ethan removed his hand, passing her the rifle before moving to wake Lillian. The other woman came awake with a startled gasp that Ethan quickly muffled. "They're coming," he whispered, positioning both women behind the barricade. "Stay down and don't fire unless I tell you." He took up position at the edge of their makeshift fort, his own rifle ready, watching as the bandits approached on foot, having left their horses below to avoid detection. "Remember," he said quietly to Lucinda, "aim low. Most people shoot too high when they're nervous." She nodded, surprised by her own steadiness as she sighted along the barrel, just as Thomas had taught her years ago when they first came west. The bandits were halfway across the plateau when Ethan's voice rang out. "That's far enough." The men froze, then scrambled for cover behind rocks and scrubby trees. "Now, friend," called the scarred leader, "this doesn't have to get messy. Just send out the ladies and whatever valuables you're carrying and we'll be on our way." "Not going to happen," Ethan replied calmly. "Turn around and leave while you still can." The bandits' laugh echoed across the plateau. "3 of us, one of you. Those aren't good odds, friend." "I'm counting 5 bullets in my rifle and 6 in my revolver," Ethan said. "That's 11 shots. How fast can you run with a bullet in your leg?" There was a moment of silence as the bandits conferred in low voices. Then, without warning, a shot rang out, splintering wood inches from Ethan's head. "Fire at will," he told Lucinda, squeezing off a shot that sent one of the bandits diving for better cover. Lucinda took careful aim at a shadow moving between rocks and pulled the trigger. The rifle's recoil slammed into her shoulder, but she was rewarded by a cry of pain and a stream of curses. "Good shot," Ethan said approvingly, firing again to keep the bandits pinned down. The exchange of gunfire continued for several tense minutes, neither side gaining an advantage. Lucinda reloaded with trembling fingers, aware that their ammunition was limited, and the bandits seemed determined. Then, just as the first rays of sunlight crested the eastern mountains, a new sound reached them: horses, approaching rapidly from the direction they had been headed. "Riders coming," Ethan warned, his gaze never leaving the bandits' positions. "Reinforcements?" Lillian asked fearfully. "Not likely," Ethan replied. "These men work alone." The pounding of hooves grew louder, and suddenly a group of mounted men appeared on the trail, not rough-looking bandits, but uniformed soldiers, the morning sun glinting off brass buttons and rifle barrels. "Army patrol," Ethan said with evident relief, standing cautiously to wave at the approaching soldiers. The bandits, seeing themselves outnumbered, broke cover and fled down the mountainside, disappearing into the rugged terrain before the soldiers could intercept them. The patrol leader, a young lieutenant with a carefully trimmed mustache, reined in his horse beside their barricade. "Everything all right here?" he asked, surveying the signs of battle with professional interest. "Bandit trouble," Ethan explained, lowering his rifle. "But your timing couldn't be better, Lieutenant. We've had reports of increased activity in these parts," the officer replied. "Where are you folks headed?" "Leadville," Lucinda answered, stepping forward. "We have family there." The lieutenant nodded. "We're patrolling this section of the trail for the next few days. You're welcome to travel with us as far as Morrison Creek. Should be safer that way." Ethan exchanged a glance with Lucinda and Lillian, who both nodded eagerly. "We'd be obliged, Lieutenant," he said. "Those bandits might think twice about coming back, but I'd rather not test that theory." With the Army patrol as escorts, they broke camp quickly and continued their journey, the soldiers' presence a reassuring buffer against further threats. Lucinda found herself riding beside Ethan on the wagon bench, while Lillian had accepted an invitation to ride in more comfort with the lieutenant in his supply wagon. "You were brave back there," Ethan said quietly as they navigated a particularly steep section of trail. "Not many people can keep their heads in their first gunfight." "It wasn't my first," Lucinda admitted. 2 years ago, when Thomas was away on a cattle drive, a drunk tried to break into our cabin. I fired a warning shot that sobered him up quickly." Ethan looked at her with newfound respect. "Thomas never mentioned that." "I never told him," Lucinda replied. "He worried enough about leaving me alone. I didn't want to give him more reason to fret." "You protected him in your way, just as he tried to protect you," Ethan observed. "I suppose we did," Lucinda agreed, the realization bringing both pain and a strange comfort. "That's what people do when they care for each other." Ethan's gaze lingered on her face, something unspoken in his eyes. "Yes," he said finally, "I believe it is." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibilities neither was ready to acknowledge. Then a call from the lieutenant ahead broke the spell, and Ethan turned his attention back to the trail, the set of his shoulders betraying a tension that had nothing to do with bandits or dangerous mountain passes. For 3 days, they traveled with the Army patrol, making good time along the increasingly difficult mountain trails. The soldiers shared their rations and their campfires, telling stories of Army life that made even Lillian laugh despite the hardships of the journey. Lieutenant Foster, the patrol leader, paid particular attention to Lillian, his admiration evident in his solicitous care for her comfort and the way his eyes followed her movements. For her part, Lillian seemed to bloom under his attention, her grief momentarily set aside as she responded to his gentle courtship. "He's quite taken with her," Lucinda observed to Ethan as they watched Lillian and the lieutenant walking together by the creek on the evening before they would part ways. "Can you blame him?" Ethan replied. "She's a beautiful woman and braver than she gives herself credit for." "Do you find her beautiful?" The question slipped out before Lucinda could stop it, immediately making her flush with embarrassment. Ethan regarded her steadily. "She's lovely," he acknowledged, "but beauty comes in many forms, Mrs. Tanner." His gaze held hers until Lucinda looked away, unable to interpret the emotions she saw there, or perhaps unwilling to acknowledge what they stirred in her own heart. The next morning, they reached Morrison Creek, where the patrol would turn south while their own path continued west toward Leadville. Lieutenant Foster took his leave of Lillian with evident reluctance, kissing her hand with formal gallantry that nevertheless conveyed deeper feelings. "If you ever return this way, Mrs. Thompson," he said, holding her hand perhaps a moment longer than propriety allowed, "I hope you will call at Fort Collins. I would be honored to see you again." "Thank you, Lieutenant," Lillian replied, her cheeks flushed pink. "Your kindness these past days has meant more than I can express." As the patrol rode away, Lillian watched until they disappeared around a bend in the trail, her expression wistful. "He seemed like a fine man," Lucinda said gently, touching her friend's arm. Lillian sighed. "He is, but my sister needs me and his duty is here. Such is life." They continued their journey with renewed caution, Ethan's vigilance never wavering despite the relative safety they had enjoyed with the Army patrol. The terrain grew more challenging as they climbed higher into the mountains, the air thinning and temperatures dropping despite the spring season. One evening, as they made camp in a sheltered valley, Lucinda noticed Ethan wincing as he lifted supplies from the wagon. "You're hurt," she said, moving to his side. "It's nothing," he insisted, but when she pressed him, he reluctantly showed her a long gash on his arm, partially hidden by his sleeve. "Must have caught it on something during the bandit fight." The wound was inflamed, angry red lines radiating from the edges. "This needs cleaning," Lucinda said firmly. "Sit down before you fall down." To her surprise, Ethan complied without argument, sinking onto a fallen log while Lucinda retrieved her small medical kit from the wagon. Lillian brought water heated over the campfire, and together they tended to Ethan's injury. "You should have said something sooner," Lucinda scolded as she gently cleaned the wound. "This could have become serious." "I've had worse," Ethan said, though his pale face and the sweat beading on his forehead belied his casual tone. "That doesn't make it right to neglect your health," Lucinda countered, applying a poultice of herbs she had brought for just such emergencies. "What good would you be to us with a raging fever?" As she worked, her fingers brushing against his skin, Lucinda was acutely aware of his gaze on her face, studying her with an intensity that made her hands tremble slightly. "Thomas was right about you," Ethan said softly. "What do you mean?" Lucinda asked, not looking up from her task. "He said you had healing hands." Ethan's voice was low, meant only for her ears. "That your touch could ease pain like nothing else." Lucinda's movements faltered. The intimacy of his words, the knowledge that Thomas had spoken of such personal things to his friend, left her feeling exposed in a way that both unsettled and strangely comforted her. "There," she said, securing the bandage and stepping back. "Keep it clean and let me check it again tomorrow." Ethan flexed his arm carefully. "Thank you." Later that night, as Lucinda lay awake listening to the night sounds of the wilderness, she found herself thinking of Ethan's words. Thomas had valued her healing touch, had spoken of it to his friend. And now that friend, a man who had carried her husband's broken body from the darkness, who had promised to protect her at risk to his own life, was looking at her with eyes that saw more than just Thomas Tanner's widow. The realization should have troubled her. Instead, it felt like the first warm breeze of spring after a long, bitter winter. The following day brought new challenges as they encountered a section of trail washed away by recent rains. Ethan scouted ahead, returning with grim news. "There's no way around," he reported. "We'll have to leave the wagon and continue on horseback." Lillian looked dismayed. "But our supplies will take what we can carry," Ethan said. "It's only about 30 miles to Leadville from here. We can make it in 2 days if we push hard." They spent the morning redistributing essential supplies into packs that could be carried by the horses. The rest, furniture, books, keepsakes, would have to be abandoned. Lucinda carefully wrapped her few treasured possessions. A daguerreotype of Thomas on their wedding day, her mother's silver hairbrush, and the letters Thomas had written during their courtship. The rest she left behind with surprising ease, finding that grief had changed her relationship with material things. By midday, they were ready to depart. Ethan had unhitched the wagon horses and fitted them with makeshift packs, leaving one for Lillian to ride. He and Lucinda would share the other, a prospect that brought a flush to her cheeks when he explained the arrangement. "It's not ideal," he acknowledged, misinterpreting her reaction as discomfort with the impropriety. "But it's the fastest way forward." "I understand," Lucinda assured him, gathering her skirts as he helped her onto the horse's back. When he swung up behind her, his chest pressed against her back and his arms encircling her to take the reins, she forced herself to breathe normally despite the rapid beating of her heart. They set off along a narrow game trail that wound through dense forest, the going slow but steady. Ethan guided the horse with confident hands, his body a solid presence behind Lucinda, steadying her when the trail grew particularly treacherous. "How much farther?" Lillian called from behind them, her voice weary after hours in the saddle. "We'll make camp at the next clearing," Ethan promised. "Should be just ahead." As twilight descended, they reached a small meadow beside a rushing stream. Ethan helped both women dismount, Lucinda's legs so stiff from riding that she nearly fell against him. His hand steadied her waist, lingering a moment before he set her gently on her feet. "Thank you," she murmured, unable to meet his gaze. They made camp quickly, the routine now familiar after days on the trail. As Lucinda prepared a simple meal from their dwindling supplies, Lillian sat by the fire, massaging her sore legs and gazing pensively into the flames. "Are you well?" Lucinda asked, concerned by her friend's unusual silence. Lillian smiled faintly, just thinking, this journey has been not what I expected. "How so?" "I thought I would be consumed by worry for my sister," Lillian admitted. "And I am concerned, of course, but I've also found myself living in a way I haven't for years. Even with the dangers, there's a freedom to this life that I never knew in Willow Creek." Lucinda understood perfectly. Despite the hardships and perils they had faced, there was an exhilarating sense of purpose to their journey, a feeling that they were charting their own course rather than merely existing within the narrow confines of society's expectations. "What will you do after you've seen to your sister?" Lucinda asked. Lillian's gaze drifted toward the mountains that separated them from Leadville. "I don't know. For the first time, I feel as though I have choices." Ethan returned from tending the horses, joining them by the fire. The flames illuminated the planes of his face, casting shadows that emphasized the weariness etched there. "Let me check your arm," Lucinda said, moving to sit beside him. He submitted to her examination without protest, watching her face as she unwrapped the bandage and inspected the wound. To her relief, the angry red lines had receded, the flesh around the cut looking healthier. "It's healing well," she pronounced, applying fresh herbs and rewrapping the bandage. "You were lucky." "Skilled nursing," Ethan countered, his fingers briefly covering hers as she tied off the bandage. The touch sent a tremor through Lucinda that had nothing to do with the chill mountain air. She withdrew her hand, suddenly conscious of Lillian's thoughtful gaze upon them. After their meal, Lillian retired early, leaving Lucinda and Ethan alone by the fire. The night was clear, stars scattered across the vast expanse of sky like diamond dust on black velvet. "We should reach Leadville by tomorrow evening," Ethan said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "Yes," Lucinda acknowledged, a strange reluctance in her voice. The prospect of arriving at their destination, which had been her singular focus for so long, now filled her with uncertainty. "What will you do once we get there?" Ethan asked, echoing the question she had posed to Lillian earlier. "Collect my sister's children," Lucinda replied. "Return to Willow Creek, I suppose." But even as she said it, she wondered if that was truly what she wanted. And after that, Lucinda considered the question. "I haven't thought much beyond that point," she admitted. "Raise the children, keep Thomas's memory alive." Ethan nodded, poking at the fire with a stick. "He would want you to be happy, you know." "I know," Lucinda said softly. "But happiness seems distant right now. It will come back," Ethan assured her. "Different, perhaps, than what you knew before, but it will come." He spoke with the quiet certainty of someone who had also known loss and found his way back to life. Lucinda wondered about his story, the events that had shaped him into the man who sat beside her, now strong yet gentle, capable of violence but protective rather than predatory. "What about you?" she asked. "After Leadville, where will you go?" Ethan shrugged. "Wherever the work takes me, I suppose. That's the cowboy way." "No place to call home, not for a long time," he admitted. "There was a ranch in Texas once, but that was another life." "What happened?" Lucinda asked gently. Ethan was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, as though the words came from somewhere deep inside him that was rarely exposed to light. "The war," he said simply. "I went off to fight for the Union. My father and brother fought for the Confederacy. When I came home, there was nothing left. The ranch burned, my family gone. So I drifted west, took work where I could find it, met Thomas on a cattle drive to Cheyenne." "I'm sorry," Lucinda said, understanding now the shadows that lived behind his eyes. Ethan's smile was sad but genuine. Life has a way of taking unexpected turns, sometimes for the worse, sometimes for the better. Their eyes met across the dying fire, and in that moment, Lucinda felt the first stirrings of something she had thought lost forever: hope, fragile as the first spring blossom pushing through snow-covered ground. The final day of their journey dawned clear and cold, the mountains ahead no longer distant sentinels but immediate presences, their peaks still snow-capped despite the advancing spring. Leadville lay nestled among those peaks, a mining town that had sprung up virtually overnight with the discovery of silver in the surrounding mountains. As they rode, the trail gradually widened, signs of human habitation becoming more frequent: abandoned prospectors' cabins, the occasional passing rider or freight wagon. By mid-afternoon, they could see smoke rising from the town in the valley below. "Almost there," Ethan said, his arm unconsciously tightening around Lucinda's waist as they negotiated a particularly steep descent. The realization that their journey was ending brought conflicting emotions for Lucinda. Relief at having reached their destination safely warred with a curious reluctance to see this chapter close. In the wilderness, away from the constraints and expectations of town life, she had discovered a strength in herself she hadn't known existed, and a capacity for new feelings that both frightened and exhilarated her. Leadville appeared before them as they rounded the final bend in the trail, a bustling frontier town of wooden buildings strung along a main street, with smaller structures climbing the gentle slopes on either side. Despite its remote location, the town hummed with activity, its prosperity evident in the substantial buildings and well-dressed inhabitants. "Where will you look for your sister's children?" Lillian asked as they rode slowly down the main street, attracting curious glances from passers-by. "The address in her letter was on Pine Street," Lucinda replied, scanning the buildings they passed. "Her neighbor was caring for the children until I could arrive." "And your sister lives on Elm Street," Ethan said to Lillian, "according to the directions you were given." They reached an intersection where the two streets diverged. For a moment, the three travelers sat motionless, reluctant to separate after the shared perils and intimacies of their journey. "I suppose this is where we part ways," Lillian said finally, her voice tinged with sadness. "For now," Lucinda amended, reaching across to clasp her friend's hand. "But Leadville isn't so large that we can't find each other again." Lillian nodded, blinking back tears. "I've valued your friendship more than I can say, Lucinda, and yours, Mr. Yates." "Ethan," he corrected with a gentle smile. "After what we've been through together, I think we can dispense with formalities." Lillian returned his smile. "Ethan, then, thank you for bringing us safely to Leadville." With a final farewell, Lillian turned her horse toward Elm Street, her straight back and proud carriage belying the exhaustion of their journey. Lucinda watched her go, feeling as though a part of herself went with her new friend. "Shall we?" Ethan asked quietly, guiding their horse toward Pine Street. The address Lucinda sought belonged to a modest but well-maintained cabin near the end of the street. As they approached, the door opened, and a woman stepped out onto the porch, shading her eyes against the late afternoon sun. "Mrs. Tanner," she called uncertainly. "Yes," Lucinda confirmed as Ethan helped her dismount. "I'm Lucinda Tanner, Sarah's sister." Relief washed over the woman's face. "Thank goodness you've arrived. I'm Martha Wilkins, your sister's neighbor." "We were beginning to worry something had happened on the trail. We encountered some difficulties," Lucinda acknowledged, "but Mr. Yates saw us through safely." Martha's gaze shifted to Ethan, who was securing the horses to a hitching post. "You're fortunate to have had such protection." The trails aren't safe these days, especially for women traveling alone. Where are the children? Lucinda asked, her heart quickening at the prospect of meeting her sister's orphaned offspring. Inside, Martha replied, stepping back to allow Lucinda entry. Emma is 6, James just turned 4. They're good children, but they've been through so much. Lucinda nodded, understanding. May I see them now? Martha led her into the cabin's main room, where 2 small figures sat at a table, the girl carefully helping her younger brother with a simple puzzle. They looked up at Lucinda's entrance, their eyes so like Sarah's, wide with curiosity and apprehension. Emma, James, Martha said gently. This is your Aunt Lucinda. She's come to take care of you just as your mama wanted. Emma, a solemn child with dark braids and a determined chin, studied Lucinda critically. Mama said you live far away. I do, Lucinda confirmed, kneeling to the children's eye level. In a town called Willow Creek, but I've come to bring you home with me. Is Mama in heaven with Papa? James asked, his small voice wavering. Lucinda felt tears prick her eyes. Yes, sweetheart. They're together now, watching over you. Emma's expression remained guarded, but James slid from his chair and approached Lucinda hesitantly. When she opened her arms, he came into them, his small body fitting against hers as though they had always known each other. Over the children's heads, Lucinda met Ethan's gaze where he stood in the doorway, watching the reunion with an expression that made her heart constrict. There was longing there, and something else, a decision being made. That evening, after the children were asleep in the small bedroom they had occupied since their mother's death, Lucinda sat with Ethan on Martha's porch, discussing plans for the return journey. We can't risk the mountain trails with young children, Ethan said, but there's a stage that runs to Denver twice weekly. From there, you could take the train most of the way back to Willow Creek. Lucinda asked, noting his choice of words. Ethan looked away, his profile strong in the moonlight. I promise to get you home safely. That includes the return journey. You've already done more than was asked of you, Lucinda pointed out. You could stay in Leadville or move on to wherever your next job takes you. Is that what you want? Ethan asked, turning to face her fully. For me to move on, the directness of the question took Lucinda's breath away. In the days they had traveled together, something had grown between them, something neither had named but both felt with increasing certainty. No, she admitted softly. That isn't what I want. Ethan's hand found hers in the darkness, his fingers warm and strong as they intertwined with her own. I lost a friend when Thomas died, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I never expected to find. He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. But Lucinda understood. She too had been caught off guard by the feelings that had developed during their journey, feelings that both honored and transcended her love for Thomas. It's too soon, she whispered, though she didn't withdraw her hand from his. I know, Ethan agreed. I'm not asking for anything, Lucinda, just the chance to see you and the children safely home. After that, we'll see what time brings. It was neither a declaration nor a promise, but rather an acknowledgement of possibilities. For now, it was enough. The next morning brought an unexpected reunion as Lillian appeared at Martha's door, her face alight with excitement despite signs of fatigue. Lucinda, she exclaimed, embracing her friend warmly. I had to come tell you my sister is recovering. The doctor says the worst has passed, and with proper care, she should regain her strength. That's wonderful news, Lucinda replied, genuinely happy for her friend. Will you stay in Leadville to care for her? For a time, Lillian confirmed. But actually, I came to tell you that I've received an invitation. Lieutenant Foster has written to ask if I might consider visiting Fort Collins when my sister no longer needs my care. The significance of this wasn't lost on Lucinda. In the short time they had traveled with the army patrol, something had kindled between Lillian and the young officer, something that might now have a chance to grow. "And will you go?" she asked, though the answer was clear in Lillian's radiant expression. "I believe I will," Lillian replied with a smile that took years from her face. "Life is too short to ignore the chance for happiness, don't you think?" The question lingered in Lucinda's mind as they prepared for departure. The stage to Denver would leave the following morning, carrying them away from Leadville and the beginning of their shared journey. Emma and James, initially wary, had gradually warmed to Ethan, especially when he produced small wooden animals he had carved during his night watches on the trail. "Are you coming with us to Willow Creek?" Emma asked him directly as they packed the few possessions the children would bring. "Yes," Ethan replied, meeting the child's searching gaze with honesty. "I promise to see you all safely home, and then—" Emma persisted, displaying the forthright nature she had inherited from her mother. Ethan glanced at Lucinda before answering. "That will be up to your aunt," he said gently. That night, as the children slept and Martha retired to her room, Lucinda and Ethan sat once more on the porch, the future stretching before them like the vast, star-filled sky overhead. "I've been thinking," Lucinda said, breaking a comfortable silence. "Willow Creek holds many memories for me, some joyful, some painful. But the children deserve a fresh start, somewhere they can build new memories without shadows of the past." Ethan studied her face in the moonlight. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that perhaps Willow Creek isn't where we need to be," Lucinda replied. "Perhaps there's somewhere else, somewhere new for all of us." "All of us," Ethan repeated, his voice carefully neutral. Lucinda took a deep breath, finding courage in the certainty growing within her heart. "Thomas will always be a part of me," she said. "Just as your past is part of you, but I believe there can be room for new beginnings alongside honored memories." "Lucinda," Ethan began, but she placed her fingers gently against his lips. "Not now," she whispered. "Not yet. Let's get the children safely to Willow Creek. I need to settle Thomas's affairs, say proper goodbyes. And then we can talk about what comes next." Ethan captured her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm that sent warmth spiraling through her. "I've waited a lifetime to find you," he said simply. "I can wait a little longer." In that moment, beneath the canopy of stars that had witnessed their journey from grief toward hope, Lucinda felt the first genuine peace she had known since the day Thomas died. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be challenges, misunderstandings, moments of doubt. But she was no longer traveling alone, and that, she realized, made all the difference. The journey back to Willow Creek passed with surprising swiftness. The stagecoach to Denver was crowded but comfortable, the children wide-eyed at their first experience of such travel. From Denver, they took the train, Emma and James pressing their faces to the window as the landscape rolled past, alternately barren and breathtakingly beautiful. Throughout the journey, Ethan remained attentive but respectful, helping with the children, securing comfortable accommodations at each stop, but always maintaining a careful distance that acknowledged the unspoken agreement between them. They were building something precious and fragile, a foundation that needed time and care to strengthen. When they finally reached Willow Creek, the town seemed smaller somehow, as though Lucinda's expanded horizons had shrunk the place that had once been the center of her world. Neighbors welcomed her back with sympathy and curiosity, their gazes lingering on Ethan and the children with unasked questions. Lucinda moved back into the cabin she had shared with Thomas, now dusty from her absence. With Ethan's help, she cleaned and organized, making space for Emma and James among the remnants of her former life. The children adapted with the resilience of youth, quickly claiming favorite spots and establishing new routines. In the evenings, after the children were asleep, Lucinda and Ethan would sit on the porch, talking softly of the day's events and gradually sharing deeper parts of themselves, hopes, fears, dreams that had been set aside during darker times. They were careful not to rush, both understanding the importance of this foundation they were building, stone by stone. As spring deepened into summer, Lucinda made her decision. She sold the cabin and most of its contents, keeping only those items that held true sentimental value. The proceeds, combined with Thomas's savings, would give them a modest but secure start elsewhere. On their last night in Willow Creek, Lucinda visited Thomas's grave, placing wildflowers on the still fresh earth. "I'll always love you," she whispered to the quiet night. "But I've found room in my heart for new love, too. I think you would understand." A gentle breeze stirred the leaves overhead, and Lucinda chose to take it as a sign of approval. The following morning, they boarded the eastbound train. Lucinda, Ethan, Emma, and James bound for a small town in eastern Colorado, where Ethan had once stayed during a cattle drive. He had spoken of its fertile land, its growing community, and the opportunities it offered for those willing to work hard and put down roots. As the train pulled away from the station, Emma looked up at Lucinda with solemn eyes. "Are we going home now, Aunt Lucinda?" Lucinda exchanged a glance with Ethan, who sat across from them with James asleep on his lap. In his steady gaze, she saw all the promise of their shared future, not without challenges, but rich with possibility. "Yes, Emma," she replied, drawing the child close. "We're going home." And as the train carried them toward new horizons, Lucinda reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point, a journey that began with loss, but had somehow, against all odds, delivered them to the threshold of happiness. Two widows had set out on a dangerous path. A cowboy had escorted them to safety. And along the way, they had all found something they hadn't known they were seeking, not just a destination, but a beginning. In the years that followed, the small house on the outskirts of Clearwater, Colorado, became a home filled with laughter, love, and the everyday miracles of family life. Ethan and Lucinda were married in a simple ceremony beneath the cottonwood trees by the creek that gave the town its name. Emma stood proudly as Lucinda's attendant, while James carried the rings with solemn determination. Ethan built a ranch from the ground up, his knowledge of cattle and horses transforming their modest acreage into a thriving operation. Lucinda established a small clinic, using her healing skills to serve the growing community. Together, they raised Emma and James as their own, the children blossoming under their care. They welcomed their first child together, a son they named Samuel Thomas Yates, in the spring of 1881. 2 years later, twin daughters joined the family, bringing joyful chaos to the household. Through it all, they remained grateful for the unexpected journey that had brought them together, a journey that began in grief, but ended in the richest kind of happiness. Occasionally, letters would arrive from Lillian, who had indeed visited Lieutenant Foster at Fort Collins. Their correspondence spoke of a whirlwind courtship followed by a military wedding. Lillian's sister had recovered fully and moved to Fort Collins to be near her, completing a circle of family that had once seemed broken beyond repair. One evening, as Lucinda and Ethan sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple, their children playing in the yard before them, Ethan took her hand in his. "Do you ever wonder," he asked, "how different our lives might have been if you and Lillian hadn't decided to make that journey to Leadville?" Lucinda considered the question, her mind traveling back to the young widow who had set out with more courage than hope, seeking only to fulfill a duty to her sister's children. "I think," she said slowly, "that some journeys are meant to be taken, even when we can't see where they'll lead. I didn't know I was traveling toward you, but somehow my heart found its way." Ethan's fingers tightened around hers. "When Thomas asked me to look after you if anything happened to him, I gave my word, but I never imagined that you'd find yourself with a wife, 5 children, and a ranch." Lucinda teased gently. "That I'd find home," Ethan corrected, his voice rough with emotion. "After so many years of drifting, I never thought I'd find a place or people that made me want to stay." Lucinda leaned her head against his shoulder, watching as their oldest son taught his little sisters how to catch fireflies in the gathering dusk. "We've come a long way from that dangerous trail through the mountains." "The best journeys," Ethan replied, pressing a kiss to her hair, "are the ones that continue long after you've reached your destination." And as night fell over their home, stars appearing one by one in the vast Colorado sky, Lucinda knew with absolute certainty that their journey begun in loss, sustained by courage, and transformed by love would continue for all the days of their lives. In the quiet moments, when she remembered the young widow who had set out on a desperate mission to save her sister's children, Lucinda marveled at how far that woman had traveled, not just in miles, but in healing, in hope, and in the capacity to embrace a future she could never have imagined. 2 widows had traveled a dangerous path. A cowboy had guided them to safety, and in doing so, they had all found their way home,